Hello again from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. In this video, I'm going to try to answer the question of why it is unlikely that either the United States or most other Western countries will even suspend diplomatic relations, let alone break them, with Saudi Arabia. And why is it unlikely that they will apply any painful economic sanctions? There is one simple word for it. The finer form of the word is petroleum, and the more informal words are crude oil or simply oil. Because Saudi Arabia has at this moment still the second largest reserves of petroleum in the world. Because petroleum is still the major ingredient of various fuels, such as gasoline and kerosene, which are still commonly used, and because the alternative fuels, such as ethanol and biogas, are still fairly rarely used, given the higher cost and then the sparse availability of such fuel stations. And because of the heavy dependence of most Western countries on the Middle Eastern and specifically Saudi oil, and the reluctance of most Western countries, including the United States, to significantly reduce their consumption of oil, despite the seriously and quickly depleting known oil reserves of the world. It is likely that there will simply be diplomatic protests at the recent assassination of Saudi journalist and dissident Mr. Jamal Khashoggi. So let us look at some figures now. Regarding petroleum or oil. We could look at its consumption figures. These figures are from 2011. The United States was then the top consuming independent state in terms of petroleum, with 18,835.5 thousand barrels of oil per day. So that would be over 18 million barrels of oil per day. China had a consumption of over 9.7 million barrels of oil per day. Japan, a consumption of over 4.4 million barrels of oil. India, consumption of over 3.2 million barrels of oil per day. Russia, a consumption of over 3.1 million barrels of oil per day. Interestingly, Saudi Arabia came next with a daily consumption of over 2.8 million barrels of oil, followed by Brazil, Germany, Canada, South Korea, Mexico, France, Iran, Britain, and Italy. Then the production of crude oil or petroleum. In 2016, Russia led it with over 10,551,000 barrels of oil per day, followed by Saudi Arabia with over 10,460,000 barrels of oil per day. Then, interestingly, the United States with over 8,875,000 barrels of oil. Then Iraq, Iran, China, Canada, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Brazil, and so forth. And then the oil exports. Saudi Arabia in 2011 led them, followed by Russia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Nigeria, Iraq, Angola, Norway, and Venezuela. The United States led in 2011 the independent countries of the world importing oil, followed by China, Japan, India, Germany, South Korea, France, Spain, Italy, and Singapore. And then countries whose oil production is 10% or less of their consumption, according to the CIA World Factbook, are Japan, Germany, South Korea, France, Italy, Spain, Netherlands, and Turkey. And Saudi Arabia, largely because of oil, is by the Arab and Middle Eastern standards a rich country with a purchasing power parity adjusted gross domestic product of $55,859 according to an estimate for this soon ending year 2018. And its Human Development Index for 2017 was 0.853, or very high. Yeah, although already 28 years have passed since then, that book, I can't remember its precise name, but its secondary title was Saddam Hussein and the Crisis in the Middle East. It was written already in September or October 1990, so before the first Persian Gulf War broke out in January 1991. It sharply criticized the United States political authorities. Then the first Bush president was in power, that is George Herbert Walker Bush, and his administration for not foreseeing beforehand Iraq's plan, or the plan of its fanatical dictator, the late Saddam Hussein, to capture its oil-rich and militarily weak neighbor, Kuwait, interestingly situated between Iraq and Saudi Arabia. For failing to enact in the policies, and actually by extension it criticized the previous Reagan administration of 2 terms from 1981 to 1989 to take the politically costly step and economically painful step of gradually but determinedly ridding the United States of its overdependence on oil. Of course, and not just the United States, but most other Western countries are over-dependent on oil nowadays. And then when former President Bush claimed that the deployment of US forces in Saudi Arabia was needed to preserve our very way of life, the writers of that critical book commented that Bush could have said it more straightly, that those American soldiers were deployed or ordered to go to the Persian Gulf region to preserve the United States' access to oil, on which its very way of life so greatly depends. But they wrote, perhaps ironically or sarcastically or cynically, I don't know, that no American president could confront the American public so directly. because the United States foreign policy had largely been based on its secure access to oil at relatively low and steady prices and in readily available amounts since the Second World War. And they concluded, yet reminding Americans of their well-known addiction is not good politics, nor is asking them to die for it. Of course, there were debates back then, and there were debates also during the Second Persian Gulf War in 2003, and then, of course, the presence of US troops in Iran for well over 10 years after that war had ended with the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, and then several months after the war he was captured, and eventually in December 2006 he was hanged. But anyway, already now, at least according to the Washington Post and the CNN, there are some conservative Republicans who are claiming that the assassinated Mr. Khashoggi actually was not such a noble democratic activist, but a mysterious man, and possibly linked to some criminal groups and so forth. It is known that he was linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. It is known that he also had some kind of either friendship or acquaintanceship with Osama bin Laden, the late leader of that notorious terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda. But anyway, in order to protect the United States, and indeed most other Western countries' access to the Middle East oil, more specifically Saudi oil, it is unlikely that any major Western industrialized countries will break off or even suspend their diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia. And it is doubtful how, if in any way, they will try to advance the cause of political democracy in Saudi Arabia, which still, among the few countries of the world that are politically so autocratic, still does not have even a directly elected national legislature. It does have, at last, by now, directly elected city and town councils. So hopefully you learned something important, or at least some important thoughts were raised by this video. Bye bye for now.